Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I am Charlotte Vignon, Curator of Decorative Arts at the Frick Collection, and the Curator of the exhibition, Pierre Gouthière, Virtuoso Gilder at the French Court. Tonight's lecture is a third and final lecture organized around the topic of Gouthière's work and legacy. And as part of this series, the exhibition will remain open for 30 minutes after the end of the lecture. Tonight's lecture is presented by Basile Baudez, whom I'm delighted to welcome. Basile is Associate Professor of Early Modern and Modern Heritage Studies at the University Paris-Sorbonne and a renowned specialist of 18th and 19th century architecture, architecture theory, and the history of artistic institutions during the Enlightenment. In the last few years, he has held teaching positions at the École Nationale de Chartres, Paris, and at the University of Pennsylvania. Basile received his PhD from the École Pratique des Hautes Études de Paris. The title of his thesis was Power and Architecture in the French Academy during the Enlightenment, Paris in comparison with Rome and Madrid. A few years earlier, he successfully passed the very prestigious Agrégation in History and Geography, a French national competition in higher education, which is very notorious for being extremely difficult. And he finished 7th out of 1,500 candidates. He has extensively published and contributed. He has extensively published and contributed to a number of projects exploring the topic of research, most recently a Civic Utopia, Architecture in the City in France, 1675-1837, and this is actually published in French, a Palace for Louis XVI, Jean-Augustin Renard à Rambouillet, which came out in the Metropolitan Museum Journal in December, and also a very ambitious forthcoming publication, edited and published with Dominique Massouni, following the symposium which he co-edited, which he co-organized in 2011. And the title of that is Chagrin, Architects and Architecture Between the Ancien Régime and the First French Empire. And this, again, it's in French. Tonight, Basile will explore the increasingly important role of architects as coordinators of interior decoration in the 18th century, and how they assembled and communicated with their team of artists and craftsmen. I believe those underlying questions are crucial in understanding the working context and practice of artists like Pierre Gouthière, and as such, Basile's lecture will be particularly appropriate in relationship to the Gouthière exhibition, which is here at the Frick, and I should remind you that the show will close very soon on February 19. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to welcome Basile Baudez to the stage.
So I'd like to thank, of course, the Frick Collection and its director, Ian Wardropper, Charlotte Vignon, a curator of decorative arts here and wonderful curator of this exhibition you absolutely have to see and see again and again and again until it closes, unfortunately, here. And go then to Paris to see the other part of the exhibition, the small, that will open in March 15. And I'd like to thank, too, the Education Department, who has done a tremendous job in organizing this talk. Writing in 1947 in a biography of Pierre-Philippe Thomire, one of the successors of Pierre Gouthière, about this jewel cabinet, realized for Empress Joséphine in 1809 on a drawing by the architect Charles Percier, Juliette Nicklaus lamented that, I quote, "This rationalist decor with bronzes disposed in the middle of the panels, without link with the general composition of the cabinet itself, is particularly cold. It is a default of all the furniture of this period designed by architects." End of the quotation. The aim of this talk is to assess and understand the role of the architect in interior decoration in France at the turn of the 18th and 19th century, by retracing the history from a century earlier. Indeed, in the 17th century, in France, a strong distinction was made between fixed and mobile decoration. The first one was designed by the architect or the mason, the second, most of the cases, by a painter or upholsterer. This situation changed at the end of Louis XIV's reign, with the emergence of a new type of artists, later called the ornamentists, and the preeminence of wainscoting decoration over textile or marble walls. Decorative sculptors had a larger hand in the interior decoration from now on. But after the mid-18th century, however, I argue that the majority of Parisian architects took a greater role in designing mobile decoration and furniture, and that tendency resulted from three decisive factors: a radical change of taste in decoration, the elevation of the status of the architect, and finally, the theory of harmonic design in the union of the arts of drawing. But first, a little definition. What we use today as the term of decorator was confined in the 18th century to ephemeral decorations, either for the theater or for ceremonies like festivals, fireworks displays, funeral, and not interior decoration as we would call today. Apart from the architect, many specialists were involved in creating a decor, and each one could develop an interest in conceiving their own projects or designs, either for parts of or for complete decors. Plaster workers for stucco decorations of ceilings, cornices, carvings, and wall decorations. Sculptor in stone for chimney pieces and marble moldings. Woodworkers, wood carvers and sculptors for wainscotings, doors, windows, picture frames and sculpted furniture and parquet. Painters on any kind of material. Upholsterers for wall hangings, textile on furniture. Cabinet maker to produce these pieces of furniture. But also, of course, and Pierre Gouthière is a famous example of it, bronze casters and gilders executing fasteners for windows and doors, wall brackets, chandeliers, chimney-piece decorations, lamps, mounts for porcelain, and so on. And finally, the silver and goldsmiths for the table service, the toilet service, the candlesticks, the inkwells, the snuff boxes. But we have to remember too that furniture and objects can be bought, mostly in the 18th century through the marchand mercier, who, as Diderot in the Encyclopedia described them, were sellers of everything, makers of nothing. Here you have a trade card of one of the most famous of them, Dominique Daguerre. It was found from the underside of a writing table, mounted with Sèvres plaques by Martin Carlin, made around 1778 and bought directly from Daguerre in his shop by the Comte du Nord, the heir to the throne of Russia, in 1784. As we can see, the client could talk directly with a dealer and buy ready-made furniture in a shop. But other factors should be also taken into account when we think about interior decoration in the 18th century. The client, of course, can bring his own taste and not listen to anyone. His knowledge of existing interiors he would have seen at a cousin's place, at a relative, at a friend's place he would be struck by, or even reading pattern books, as one published by engravers, like Jean Lepôtre, as you can see. Keeping in mind this context, we can nevertheless try to trace an evolution in the involvement of the architects in interior decoration in France, starting in the 17th century. In the 17th century, indeed, there was a strict separation between what we call immovable property and fixed property, such as the built-in architecture, chimney pieces, windows, ceilings, and the tangible property, such as furniture, textile, pieces of art, lighting. The architect would be responsible for the contract for the first one, in the first stage of the building process, and in most of the cases, in a second and separate moment, another person would be responsible for the movable furniture. Indeed, for interior decoration, there was no self-evident reason why the managerial responsibility of the different trades should necessarily fall to an architect. Painted decoration, for example, was very common in the mid-17th century, as we can see here at the Hôtel Colbert de Ville à Cerf. Here the painter was responsible for the entire decoration, and it was the same, for example, at the Louvre, in the apartments of the Queen Anne of Austria. The main sculptor, Michel Anguier, the architect, worked on the designs given by the painter, Giovanni Romanelli. At the famous Hôtel Lambert, built by Louis Levaux, the entire decoration of the main space, the main reception piece, the Galerie of Hercules, Galerie d'Hercule, was designed by a young painter, Charles Lebrun, who acted himself as a contractor for other trades. But if we look slightly closely at the painted vault, we can see that the painter imitated another type of decoration, more common than even painted wood, tapestries. Indeed, in the 17th century, when textiles dominated interiors, an upholsterer often played the coordinating role in the second phase of the interior decoration. The upholstery, as an inheritance from the Middle Ages, formed still the greatest part of interior decoration until the last decade of the century. We know that, for example, the interior decoration of the royal castle of Duval for Louis XIV, rebuilt after 1775 by Jules Hardouin-Mansart, was undertaken by two upholsterers, Simon de Lobel and Antoine Doublet. And this division of work between architects and upholsterers can be illustrated by the two main focus of the interior decorations. As we can see here, the bed, and facing the bed, the chimneypiece. The upholsterer had the main role in the bed. Indeed, the textile and the bed gave the tonality of the seating of the furniture, as we can see here, as it becomes more and more common after the 1640s. And it's a principle that stays all along the 18th century. Here I show you an example on a snuff box painted by Louis-Nicolas von Blarenberg that shows here the bedchamber in the Hôtel de Choiseul, and you can see the magnificent bed and its upholstery that gives the entire set tone of the room. If 17th century architectural treatises, like the one by Pierre Lemuet, the manière de bâtir pour toutes sortes de personnes, the way to build for every kind of people, we can say, don't include interior decorations, one can nevertheless see on this section on the right of the Hôtel Tubeuf that the architect illustrated the main fixed decoration piece, the chimneypiece. Chimneypieces are the only type of decorative designs that can be moved, and we have to remember that it's a mobile decoration. We can change the chimneypiece as much as you want, it's just fixed on the wall and you can unfix it from the wall. It doesn't belong to the wall. So these chimneypieces are the only types of decorative design published by architects in the 17th century. Here you have two examples. And even when the design of the chimneypiece becomes very simple at the end of the century, around 1680, 1690, and when mirrors were added on top of the table of the chimney, in their superior part, what would be called the cheminée à la royale, the royal chimneypiece, architects continue to publish collections of engraved models of chimneys. And the fact that the chimneys are still, it's the only mobile piece of decoration that is still in the competence of the architect, can be expressed all along the 18th century, when it was revived at the end of the 18th century by architects like Giambattista Piranesi, or even François-Joseph Bélanger, who worked so much with Gouthière. But it happened at this moment where the architect had claimed the entire field of interior decoration in an unprecedented way. And that happened in several steps. If Jules Hardouin-Mansart, as we have seen, let upholsterers design the decoration at the Château du Val at the beginning of the architect's career, the more powerful he became, reaching at the end of the century the direction of the king's buildings, the more involved in the design of every aspect of the decoration he became, modeling himself on his predecessor, the painter Charles Lebrun, as we saw, acting as a contractor for the Galerie d'Hercule. His biographer and main assistant, Robert de Cotte, in his brief state of the works of Mr. Mansart, recalls that the architect gave drawings not only for all the fixed ornamentations as profiles of the cornices, for which he was highly renowned, for marble floors, as we can see here, but also for something new, the sculpture of wainscoting, and every detail of the fixed furniture. Here you have a drawing of the billiard room of Louis XIV's small apartment in Versailles. And here the office of Hardouin-Mansart not only drew the wainscoting, decided which picture of the royal collections would fit in the spaces left blank, but also drew the fixtures to shed light on the pictures at the moment when they needed so much light, because billiard was an evening activity. With Jules Ardoin-Mansart, so at the end of Louis XIV's reign, we therefore witness a further step in the extension of the architect's mastering on interior decoration. And the change of fashion for the covering of the walls from marble to wainscoting represents a turning point. The last marble walls designed in France are for the Salon of Hercules in Versailles. Here you are. But at this time, wainscoting has already replaced walls, marbles, as we can see here on the drawing of the new King bedchamber in Versailles. And as we can see on this contemporary view of the King's bedchamber, upholstery is still largely dominant in the decoration, but gilt wood panels have replaced the marble walls. Wood panels that can be moved as a chimney and more easily than a chimney, and really not as easily as marble walls. This phenomenon led the way to new actors who will take more and more importance in interior decorations in the years to follow, the ornamentists and the decorative sculptor. The term ornamentist was coined in the 19th century to describe designers of decorative arts, but in the 18th century they were usually known only according to the art in which they had received their training. One of the most famous inventors of the Rococo style, Juste Aurèle Meissonnier, for example, even if he was not practicing goldsmith, was a member of the Goldsmiths Guild. Meissonnier designed all kinds of things, silver objects, clocks, furniture, but also paneling. He received commissions of interior decoration from all over Europe, from Portugal to Poland. And this variety was possible mostly because he held, after 1726, the position of designer for the King's bedchamber and cabinet, an important office in a very peculiar administration, the one of the menu plaisir du roi. The King's small pleasures, the big pleasures being during Louis XIV's reign, war, of course, and buildings. So the designer was in charge of personal effects of the sovereign and his family, small items, and mostly entertainments, such as funerals, for example. The artist was what was called the dessinateur de la chambre et du cabinet. And the office was held after 1674 by an engraver, Jean Bérin. And because he had to conceive funeral ceremonies and fireworks and stage design and costumes, the dessinateur was responsible for orchestrating many different trades and designing a wide range of objects and decoration in a wide range of materials. And for someone as ambitious and creative as Jean Bérin, it expanded even to furniture design. And if we turn this page, this sheet of where we have theater design, what do we find on the verso of the sheet? We find here the design for a chest of drawers that will ultimately be built by the ebonist Opner. It gave birth to a new type of designer at the end of the 17th century, at the intersection of the arts and theater, able of designing a wide range of objects and interior decoration, like even ceilings, which was until then mostly in the architect's competence. And one cannot neglect the influence of theater experience in this tendency of mastering multiple artists and giving an entire decoration scheme. Charles de Vailly, the architect, a few years later, whom Bélanger in Urology praises to be the first to master every aspect of interior decoration, was trained by Giovanni Servandoni, the architect who revolutionized theater decoration in the middle of the century and realized this decoration for the Château de Condé-en-Brie outside of Paris. These ornamentists were trained as engravers or painters, but as the fashion for wainscoting took over Paris during the first third of the 18th century, they were soon supplanted by sculptors. Indeed, by contrast with the 17th century, painters in the 18th century rarely grasped control of the conception, still less the practical organization of complex decorative schemes. As the designs for lambris, wainscoting, evolved into increasingly intricate patterns, and the shape of other doors became even more fanciful, painters more usually found themselves at the mercy of panel sculptors. Bruno Pons, who wrote extensively on the matter, estimates that approximately 150 master sculptors were active in the first third of the 18th century in Paris. They were most members of the Guild of Painters of Sculptors, the Académie de Saint-Luc, which was its official name. But only around 20 workshops were working in ambitious interior decorations. And these sculptors, ornamentist sculptors, were detached from a specific material. They could work on wood, plaster, stone, or even cardboard. As an example here, we have a work of Jules Desgoulons and André Le Goupil, who worked in the Hotel Perrin de Moras, with now Place Vendôme. They were working under the direction of the architect Jacques Gabriel V, the first architect to the king. And Katie Scott recounts that the estimate, drawn up in 1723 for the sculpted decoration of the hotel, charged the two sculptors to execute their work in conformity with the small-scale drawings provided. Provided by whom? By the architect. These drawings tended to be schematic and primarily concerned the general arrangement, articulation of the composition. Sculptors were instructed, moreover, first to redraw this design to scale on the walls of the designated rooms, so the architect might judge the overall effect. And very few of these designs to scale survive. I show you some that was found by the restorers in Versailles, in the southern aisle of the castle, when they took off 19th century panels. Then they had to copy then on second time upon paper of identical size, in order, presumably, that once approved by the architect, the contour might be pricked for transfer on the prepared wood panels. The details were left to be elaborated by panel sculptors during the course of execution. Nicolas Pinault, whose work we see here, was one of these exceptional sculptors, about whom a generation later, Pierre Pat, in the continuation of the most famous architectural course of the 18th century, the one by Jacques-François Blondel, was lamenting that because of Nicolas Pinault, I quote, sculpture gained absolute control over architecture. Nicolas Pinault, the son of a sculptor, was trained in sculpture at the Paris Guild, as Académie de Saint-Luc. But he was also trained in other trades by Thomas Germain in silversmiths to the king, and learned architecture under Jules Hardouin-Mansart. The exceptional range of his ability was made possible when he left Paris for St. Petersburg in Russia in 1716 to become Peter the Great's first sculptor. But there he gave not only drawings for interior decoration, as we can see here, but also plans for an arsenal, a palace, funerary monuments, churches. And when he came back to Paris in 1727, he brought the experience of this freedom and established himself as one of the powerful forces in the creative process, specializing in decorative sculpture and initiating what was not done before. Authors underline the creativity of Nicolas Pinault and some of these wood sculptors, and their importance in the birth of a style, the one that Blondel would call afterwards the genre picturesque. And this genre was then published and diffused in print, as we can see here by Jean Mariette, and contributed to his fame and influence on architects and patrons. In his book, The Homme du Monde éclairé par les arts, The Man of the World Enlightened by the Arts, published in 1774, Jacques-François Blondel explains that at this period, the period of Nicolas Pineau, most Parisian architects were only able to draw plans and relied on wood carvers or ornamentists like Meissonier or sculptors like Pineau for interior embellishments. If, as we will see, sculptors don't maintain absolute control over architecture in the second half of the century, however, we have to remember that some exceptional wood sculptors kept a certain freedom in their designs, like Jacques Verbergt, who worked with Henri-Jacques Gabriel for the king, Gilles-Paul Cauvet, who was the director of the Académie de Saint-Luc, the guild, or Jules-Hugues Rousseau, who worked with his brother, Jean Siméon, who was a decorative painter. And here I can't resist to show you some details of the Méridienne to see the quality and inventiveness of these sculpted panels here. Dissociation in the first half of the century between the sculptors who worked the marble human figures and belonged, for the most successful of them, to the Académie Royale of Painting and Sculpture, which was free, we would free them from the guild itself. And ornamental sculptors who belonged to the guild, like Pineau, was key to understand the role of the architect in the years to come. I want to give an example of the Schlotz family. Three brothers, three sculptors. The eldest, Michel-Ange, of course, Michel-Ange, is mostly a figure sculptor. But these two other brothers, Paul Ambroise and Sébastien Antoine, were clearly ornamental sculptors. The two last Schlotz brothers indeed have succeeded in 1750 to Meissonier in the charge of dessinateur du cabinet de la chambre du roi, as we saw, and were therefore designing, like their predecessors, furniture, like Jean Bérin, like Meissonier. And here you have an example of one of the most famous pieces of furniture of the 18th century. But interestingly enough, in 1764, they were followed in the office of dessinateur, not by an engraver like Bérin, a goldsmith like Meissonier, or a sculptor like them, but by an architect and painter, Michel-Ange Charles, another Michelangelo. Seconded 3 years later by another architect, Bélanger, and succeeded after his death in 1778 by another architect, Paris. This reveals a profound change and a new role for the architect in interior decoration in the second half of the 18th century. The first reason, the first factor of this change is a change in taste. In 1754, Charles-Nicolas Cochin, the principal advisor of the director of the King's Buildings on artistic matters, published in the main journal of the time, the Mercure de France, his petition to the goldsmiths, chasers, and carvers of wood for apartments and others by a society of artists, in which he castigated the Rococo style of decoration, for which mostly the wood carvers were responsible. His main advice to the wood carvers was to follow the rules of the good architecture. And as models, interestingly enough, Cochin refers to, I quote, the Vieux Louvre, the Tuileries, and several other royal buildings of the last century, which are universally recognized as fine things. Here we have an encouragement to go back to a style of decoration where architectural decoration designed by architects commanded the interior design. And we therefore witness the replacement of vegetal ornaments by architectural motifs such as pilasters and capitals. And here I show you two designs for a bookcase, one by a wood carver, Herpin, here in the Hôtel de Soubise, and the other one by an architect, Jean-François de Neforge, in one of his treatises. This transformation towards a more structured partition of the walls was exemplified by the work of the architect Pierre Contant d'Ivry. Jacques-François Blondel, him again, in the Encyclopédie, illustrates Contant's design for the Palais Royal, made in the middle of the century, and praises this return of the pilasters and strict orthogonality. And you will notice here the similarity here between the frame of the window, not the window actually, of the mirror, and the one if you go in the Fragonard room, as it was reconstructed at the beginning of the 20th century. It established the absolute perfect taste of the second half of the century, as it was seen by interior decorators when they built the fric. With the publication of Voltaire's Century of Louis XIV in 1751, the revival of the cult of his minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, what contemporaries called the grand goût, the great taste, like for the great king, led a revival to more architectural, more structured interior decorations, imitating the one of the 17th century. This grand goût was revived by the younger generation of innovative architects, such as Charles de Vailly. And here I show an example that Fabien Passavy just reattributed for the Château de Montmusard, built between 1765 and 1768 in Burgundy. At Maison Lafitte, for the Comte d'Artois, the brother of Louis XVI, François-Joseph Bélanger went as far as to replace the cheminée à la Royale with his mirror by a large sculptural monument, reminiscent of the French 17th century monumental chimney pieces that he found in the rest of the castle. But if we step back and look at Bélanger's dining room, we see other models, antique ones. Indeed, the renewed interest for the great taste was mixed with the rediscovery of antique models, dug in Rome and Campania, and copied by artists who made the journey to Italy, especially the ones who stayed long enough at the French Academy in Rome as pensioners of the king after having won an academic competition, but an academic competition that was only open to painters, figural sculptors, and architects. And this return to antiquity favored these artists over wood or plaster carvers, goldsmiths, decorative painters, and all the practitioners of non-fine arts. And artists not only copied sculptural details from the classical Roman architecture, as we can see here with the roses of the temple of Jupiter Stator, for example, but also with the discovery of Roman paintings in the Vesuvian cities, casted a fresher look at some early Renaissance well-known models, like Raphael's Arabesque at the Vatican. And here we witness a phenomenon of return of a very well-known type of decoration, the Arabesque, in the last third of the century. But this time, not made by ornamentists, but sanctioned by archaeology and a direct knowledge of Rome. And here you have the example of the architect Clérisseau working with the painter de la Vallée Poussin for the interior of one of the most lavish interior that was made for financier Grimaud de la Reynière. And this sanction of antiquity extended to furniture. I show you here one of the most famous desk of the 18th century, made by Louis Lorrain for another finance person, La Livre de Julie. Le Lorrain was a painter, but who, in the contact of the Roman international milieu, developed in his drawings and designs a new taste based on archaeological sources, working closely hand-to-hand with architects and sculptors to copy, dig Roman artifacts. The desk shows large garlands, friezes of threads, Vitruvian skulls, lion feet, and strict orthogonal lines, as they were favored by architects. And Bélanger, in a letter written at the beginning of the 19th century, was praising the taste of one of his longtime associates, the sculptor L'Huillier, with whom he worked on several decorative projects. And the reason why he was praising this sculptor, the main reason of his value, was because L'Huillier spent 22 years in Rome. Decorative objects, because they derived from antique models, reached the status of the production of the fine arts. With the stamp of antiquity and archaeology, the whole domain of decorative arts, which was in the first half of the century mostly monopolized by ornamentists and wood carvers and furniture makers, is from now on fully worthy of the architect. Tout est de son ressort. Everything falls into his competence, writes Jacques-François Blondel about the architect. Indeed, when the architect masters every detail of the decoration, he accomplishes a unique art piece and affirms himself as an artist and not as a worker or craftsman. The goal is to assert the place of architecture among the fine arts when it always risks to be relegated to its technical aspect or its utilitarian function. But there's another reason of the involvement of architects in decorative arts, as we call them now. And the reason is economical. In a time when elites are investing heavily in costly materials and follow closely the new fashions, Parisian architects try to occupy a very lucrative market. Architects are no more paid by the number of visits on the building site, but more commonly on an honorarium of the rate of approximately 5% of total expenditure. So an expenditure they try to raise as a maximum. And the Abbé Marc-Antoine Laugier, in his Observation on Architecture, published in 1765, is maybe the last one to blame architects for according too much attention to interior decoration. And the architect Guillemot, 3 years later, responds, "One doesn't have everyday churches to build. And it would be really sad if artists," and he really used the word artists and not architects, were following the advice of the Abbé Laugier by neglecting interior decoration, because one can assure that it's really in this part that the nation is unrivaled. Architects' authority was seen to rest not on entrepreneurship, but on powers of organization, and more important still, on the ability to conceive the design of a building in all its parts. This is why Jacques-François Blondel, the most innovative architectural pedagogue of Europe, insisted that his students draw interior decorations, and why, when he became professor at the Académie Royale, he kept on giving interior decoration competition topics, like this one in February 1769, of a big bedchamber, like chambre de parade. And as we can see here with a detail, every aspect was supposed to be designed by the architect. Nothing was left. And the fact that the statutes of this Royal Academy forbade its members to act as contractors emphasizes a trend in the definition of the architect towards a pure designer. And we have to remember that Claude-Nicolas Ledoux, the famous architect, reached fame as a decorator, for his work at the Café Militaire, a coffee shop, at the beginning of his career. And this interest for interior decoration even extended to past decorations. Bruno Pons recalled that Charles de Vailly had brought an entire room decoration made by the painter Simon Vouet in the 1630s at the Hôtel de Bouveron. And even Ledoux had one from the Gallery of Chessy by Vouet and had reinstalled it in the Hôtel d'Alluil. The reinvestment by architects of interior decoration was acknowledged by world institutions in the second half of the 18th century. We saw it at the Menu Plaisir, where architects replaced engravers and painters, but also at the Garde-Meuble, in charge of the furniture, of the furnishing of royal houses. It's an architect, Jacques Gondouin, who was appointed as principal designer of the Garde-Meuble at the death of a painter, Alexis Perrotte, in 1769. And we can here show you an example of a not well-known architect, Claude Martin Goupy. Here we have someone belonging not to the academy, speculating in the Faubourg Poissonnière, working as a contractor. But here, as we can see from two examples from a sketchbook, which is in a private collection, is interested heavily in decorative schemes. The drawings depict designs of painted ceilings, cornices, fireplaces, and numerous other details, with annotations of dimensions and colors, and even the name of the clients. As we can see, at the end of the century, even the second-tier Parisian architects, like Goupy, contractors, considered interior decoration details of their own competence. This is the consequence not only of a change in taste, of a new status of the architect, but consequently a renewed focus on the concept of harmony. The notion of harmony dates from the first architectural treatises of the Renaissance, of course, but it was translated in interiors only in the first third of the 17th century, when, as we saw, upholsterers tried to design matching fabric on chairs, bed, table covers, window curtains, and stools. But a renewed interest in architectural theory on harmony in interior decoration springs up in the 18th century from the books, especially of the architect Germain Beaufrand, a book written both in Latin, because it was the scholar's language, and he wanted to assert himself as a scholar, and in French, because people needed to read it. Following Horatius' Art of Poetry, Beaufrand writes, "The architect must not combine the incompatible. Here we have a salon decorated with pilasters with large figures. The designers had the ceiling of grotesques. Here is a gallery decorated with history paintings. Some of the subjects are sacred, others profane. All these are incompatible." And later on, I quote, "Furnishings greatly enhance the look of an apartment, above all when hangings, tables, sofas, chairs, and other pieces seem to have been made expressly for the room in which they are, in conformity with its plan and outlines." And in the conclusion of its chapter, called On Interior Decoration and Furnishings, he writes, "In general, every department of architecture, sculpture, and painting must combine to make a single whole." And by publishing in its book his interior designs for the Hôtel d'Argenton and the Hôtel de Soubise, Germain Beaufrand set on the same level his architectural realizations and his interior designs, establishing the latter as legitimate works of art. Beaufrand is one of the first architects to control the totality of the decoration of its buildings. For example, his contemporary, the architect Michel Chevautet, delegated on one of his main building sites the conception of the wainscoting to the sculptor Herpin. For Beaufrand, doors, windows, chimney mantles are conceived as equivalent ensembles, underlining each other by the same border. Fixed and mobile furniture are designed at the same moment, thinking the entire decoration all together. They appear on plates of architectural treatises, like Jacques-François Blondel's distribution des maisons de plaisance, or in real here. And we can see the fixed and the mobile furniture respond to each other. The boiseries respond to the furniture itself. Everything is designed at the same moment. And one of the consequences of this new search for harmonic design is the appearance of a new type of furniture, the architectural furniture, as for example, the console on 2 feet that can't stand by itself unless it is against a wall. It is designed absolutely at the same moment as the wainscoting and the frames of the mirrors. The chimney piece, which has traditionally been of the competence of the architect, still commands the general mode of the entire decoration of the room. As we know, and as I invite you to read the catalog, the Gouthière catalog, it's absolutely well explained. The Riesner, the ebonist, reports in his memoranda that the furniture for the noble room, the Salon des Nobles, in the Queen's apartment in Versailles, were done, I quote, in the taste of the chimney piece. And as we can see, the ebonist used the same motifs of Vitruvian waves and enrollment and garlands on the sides that were done by Gouthière. Furniture and architecture were from now on thought and designed as a whole at the same moment, even in the disposition of the furniture. And it's something that really struck the Swedish architect Erik Palmstad when he came to Paris in 1778. He showed the distinction between the architectural furniture, the console, as we can see here, up here, up here, on the opposite wall of the chimney piece, the meubles meublants aligned along the walls, sofas and armchairs, here, here, and here. And finally, the third kind of furniture, the usual seats, the sièges courants, that were closer to the center and on which they can be moved. The architect's competence extended even to the design of the upholstery. Le Camus de Mézières, in his Genius of Architecture, a very influential treatise written in 1780, insists on the fact that the upholsterer should take no initiative and that the architect should give all the designs and colors of the textile decoration of the room. The end of the century is indeed a moment of renewal of textile decoration, and I show you here the image of the Duchess of Choiseul bedroom at a castle in Chanteloup. Upholstery is here to counterbalance the severity of the architectural decoration. It plays a parallel role as a return of fashion for painted panels, as we saw, displaying arabesque decoration, which are here to entertain the guests. But this time, the designer is an architect and not an upholsterer, who went to Rome and copied on the motif, and no more an engraver. Here you can see everything by Paris. I'd like to finish this talk by stretching the importance of someone who was considered as the first interior decorator in the modern sense of the term, Jean Demosthène Dugourd. Son of an army officer, student at the Collège de Juilly, one of the best colleges in France, that provided an amazing, excellent classical formation. He went on a journey in Rome at 15, in the new French ambassador's suit. And there he learned to draw from antique models. When he came back, he possessed two essential qualities that summarized the end of the century: prodigious draftsmanship skills and close knowledge of antique motifs. The architect Bélanger noticed him and integrated him in his office. De Gourd eventually married his sister. But de Gourd established himself as a designer specialized in interior decoration, working extensively for the French elite and for the foreign courts, like the Spanish one. I show you here a cabinet design for the Pardo Palace, and for the Escorial, he was commissioned to redecorate 3 rooms, an Etruscan gallery, a Chinese cabinet room, and an Egyptian room. And here you have an example of the Egyptian room, inspired by Egyptian tombs and features extraordinary numbers of Egyptian motifs. And that reflects the freedom that de Gourd learned from Piranesi in Rome. He gave also numerous designs for silk manufactories in Lyons, initiating a new moment in the relationship between architects and industrial that will be witnessed in the 19th century. To conclude, in late 1792, early 1793, the all-powerful Jacques-Louis David was asked to make drawings for the furniture of the National Convention in the Tuileries. He agreed to take on only the armchair of the president and recommended 2 young architects, Percier and Fontaine, whose set design work he just had seen and admired, to design the rest. They designed the entire furniture that the ebonist Georges Jacob made, starting a long-lasting commitment in interior decoration and furniture design. And this commitment was diffused in all Europe in the 72 plates published in installments between 1801 and 1812 of the Recueil des décorations intérieures, recently studied by Iris Moon. Both a pedagogical tool for students and artisans and an inspiration for clients, these plates represent the apotheosis of the staging of interiors and furniture. And in the preliminary discourse written by the 2 architects, one can read, I quote, "We think that, given the close relationship that holds between architecture and furniture, architects should not only avoid ceding control of it to workers' routine, but that, out of an interest in art and in their own honor, they cannot exercise too much care over a part of it whose good or bad implementation affects the very future of architecture." As we can see with this paper model, where structure and decoration are treated in the same level, this statement was the outcome of a long journey I wished to retrace here tonight. Thank you.